escalating trade conflict between the United States and the European Union has reached new heights, following U.S. President Donald Trump's imposition of a 20% tariff on imports from Europe. This bold step, part of a broader strategy to address what he perceives as trade imbalances, has provoked a strong response from EU leaders, with the European Commission already preparing retaliatory measures. However, beyond the retaliatory rhetoric and protective posturing, it's increasingly clear that the EU's economic strategy faces deep flaws that could undermine its long-term interests. On April 2, 2025, Trump declared a national emergency that would impose a 10% baseline tariff on imports from all nations, with additional tariffs for those considered to have unfair trade practices. The EU, along with China, Japan, South Korea, and India, was directly impacted by these tariffs. While the EU expressed its regret and readiness to defend its interests, Trump's measures mark a decisive turn in U.S. trade policy, one that could further destabilize global economic structures. The broader global response to the U.S. tariffs has been predominantly negative. China immediately condemned the move, labeling it economic bullying and threatened retaliatory actions of its own. The EU, though echoing similar concerns, has emphasized the importance of negotiation in resolving the dispute. However, the EU's approach to handling such tensions seems increasingly out of touch with a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. One of the more troubling aspects of the EU's response to the tariff conflict is its persistent naivety when dealing with U.S. trade policies. Despite the clear protectionist turn by the U.S. under Trump's America First mantra, the EU continues to be caught in a reactive stance, rather than proactively shifting its trade dynamics toward a more diversified set of international partners. This passive response is allowing the EU to be further sidelined by U.S. economic hegemony, which increasingly uses tariffs as a weapon to impose its will on global trade. A crucial problem for the EU is its overdependence on its trade relationship with the U.S., which remains its largest trading partner. The deep economic ties between the two have often constrained the EU's ability to make independent, strategic decisions in its economic policies. The EU's continued reliance on the U.S. for trade creates a vulnerability that President Trump has adeptly exploited, using economic leverage to push his protectionist agenda. For decades, the EU has aligned its economic policies with those of the U.S., espousing the benefits of free trade and market liberalization. However, under Trump, the U.S. has abandoned its traditional commitment to free trade and instead opted for tariffs and economic aggression. This shift should have prompted a more assertive and critical reevaluation of the EU's economic strategy. Yet EU leaders have largely failed to adapt. The EU's consistent emphasis on negotiation, without acknowledging the U.S. administration's fundamental disregard for cooperative economic relations, shows a lack of political fortitude and strategic foresight. The EU's hesitant response to U.S. tariffs contrasts sharply with the more assertive actions of China and other rising economic powers. China, for instance, has swiftly countered U.S. tariffs with its own retaliatory measures, signaling its growing willingness to challenge U.S. economic dominance. In contrast, the EU seems to be caught in a diplomatic limbo, caught between wanting to avoid escalating tensions and failing to acknowledge that its economic sovereignty is increasingly under threat. The EU's approach to trade relations with the U.S. has long been marked by an unwillingness to stand up to the realities of global economic power shifts. While the EU maintains its stance of hoping for a negotiated solution, it does so at the expense of its own strategic interests. The ongoing trade war exposes the growing fragility of the EU's economic position, and the longer it remains passive, the more vulnerable it becomes to future U.S. economic policies. A key part of the EU strategy should be to reduce its dependence on the U.S. and pursue more diversified trade relationships. While the EU has taken steps to explore new partnerships, such as its growing ties with Vietnam and its ongoing engagement with China, the fact remains that these efforts are still in their infancy compared to the EU's deep entanglement with the U.S. economy. Vietnam, for example, is an emerging player in the global economy, with increasing importance in the EU's diversification strategy. Vietnamese President Luong Quang's recent meeting with Belgian King Philippe underscored the EU's desire to invest in sectors like high-tech manufacturing and renewable energy. Vietnam is also positioning itself as a key hub for EU-Asian trade relations, with upcoming visits from Chinese President Xi Jinping and EU leaders. Yet, despite these initiatives, the EU still lags behind in its efforts to break free from the US-centric model that has long defined its trade policy. The EU's reliance on the US has been so strong that it has often neglected the potential of other markets. This lack of diversification has now come back to haunt the EU, as Trump's tariffs expose the limitations of a trade strategy that assumes US cooperation and alignment. The EU should have been more proactive in forging stronger economic partnerships with rising economies, such as China and Vietnam, instead of continuing to cling to the idea of a favorable US-EU relationship, which is increasingly unsustainable. China, in particular, offers the EU an opportunity to reduce its reliance on the US as a trade partner. As China has grown in economic importance, the EU has not sufficiently capitalized on its potential as a key partner. Despite rhetoric about fostering closer ties, the EU continues to treat China with caution, largely out of concern for US reactions. This timid approach has resulted in the EU missing out on significant opportunities to strengthen its economic position in the face of rising global challenges. The broader global context of the trade war between the US and the EU highlights the EU's misplaced priorities. Rather than focusing on strategic diversification, the EU continues to act as though the transatlantic relationship remains as stable as it once was. The reality, however, is that the US has abandoned multilateralism and free trade in favor of aggressive protectionism. And the EU is finding itself increasingly isolated in a world that is rapidly moving toward a multipolar trade system. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, has criticized the US tariffs as a serious threat to the global economy, warning that they will harm consumers worldwide. While the EU is preparing countermeasures, including tariffs on €26 billion worth of US goods, this response is at best reactive. The EU's insistence on countering US tariffs without fully engaging in a rethinking of its broader trade strategy is symptomatic of its reluctance to confront the larger shift in global power dynamics. Von der Leyen and other EU leaders continue to emphasize the importance of dialogue, but it is becoming increasingly evident that this is a futile approach when dealing with an administration that is not interested in cooperative trade practices. Trump's imposition of tariffs, including the proposed 50% tariff on bourbon, demonstrates a willingness to escalate the situation, regardless of global repercussions. Yet, rather than confronting the root cause of these tensions, US economic aggression, the EU continues to focus on dialogue and negotiation, missing the opportunity to adapt to the new geopolitical order. This failure to adapt not only weakens the EU's position in the short term, but also threatens its long-term economic independence. By continuing to engage in fruitless negotiations with the US, the EU risks becoming increasingly subservient to US economic policies, with long-term consequences for its global competitiveness. The EU must recognize that the US is no longer a reliable partner in the global economic system. The protectionist policies adopted by Trump are damaging not only to the EU, but to the global economic framework that has existed for decades. Rather than continuing to rely on the US for trade, the EU must urgently seek new trade relationships, particularly with rising economies like China and Vietnam. This is not merely a matter of economic survival. It is an issue of economic sovereignty. By failing to take bold, decisive action, the EU risks not only undermining its own economic future, but also perpetuating a system where it remains an economic subordinate to the whims of US policies. The EU's failure to diversify its trade partnerships, coupled with its continued dependence on the US, leaves it vulnerable to further economic coercion by Washington. The escalating trade tensions between the US and the EU are a wake-up call for Europe. If the EU continues to prioritize short-term diplomatic engagements over long-term strategic shifts, it will find itself increasingly marginalized in the global economic order. The EU must break free from its historical dependence on the US and embrace a new, more diversified approach to global trade. Only by doing so can it regain its economic independence and ensure its place in the future of the global economy.